everyone from the Ski Instructor Academy. Well, we're going to be tackling part 3 of this series of health, fitness, well-being, and we're looking at the mobility assessment. Mobility being one of the most challenging aspects for many of you to be able to adapt on the piste. Now, if somebody has, at the high level, fantastic range of motion and movement, on top of that great understanding of stability, core strength, agility, then they are going to have that little bit of extra play either side when it comes to situations that are challenging or when they come to falling, etc. It really is important that you understand the concept that if you lack range of motion in a particular area, it isn't suddenly going to invent itself when you're going down the challenging mogul run, or when you're trying to make fast turns through the carving on a GS course. That isn't going to happen. So we need to be aware of what our mobility restrictions are and what our weaknesses are, so we can maybe understand how to improve them, but also how to get round them safely for the minute. So first of all, I always try to emphasize spinal mechanics, because I'm sure some of you have tweaked your back at some point, and at that issue you would tell people, hey, I was immobile, I could not do anything. It's different to, for example, hurting your ankle, knee, or your shoulder, or your elbow. You can still continue on and limp by, even with a particularly bad knee. I need to get this knee replaced, but in my case, I know my tolerance and I know what I can do to get round that issue, and actually I can still ski whilst waiting to replace that knee. So it's different though when you hurt your back, particularly because the central nervous system is running down the spine, and any type of damage there, and it will be really a serious issue. So we really need to look after our backs, which often take a lot of the impact when we are in positions that we shouldn't be when boarding and skiing. So address a broken midline first. And I can demonstrate this when I have my groups in the gym. I demonstrate what happens if I break somebody's midline and how weak they become within their arms or their legs as soon as I put a bit of a kink somewhere. So it is of an issue, but we also need to understand that creating torque there is of the utmost importance, and you can move your spine. Some people get very anxious when you say that, but we can't always be using the principle of a braced neutral spine, often referred to now as the two-hand rule, where we look at maintaining certain points of the spine and not closing them together and not opening them up into extension. So if I'm telling you you can move your spine safely, what do I mean? Well, I first want to point out the nose, and that is local extension and local flexion. So this is where maybe you see this often between the thoracic spine and the lumbar spine, where somebody is broken. And this is now a local extension, as opposed to what could be classed as a global extension or a global flexion running from the bottom to the top of the spine. And indeed, even in heavy deadlifts, some people post pictures up and say, look at this guy, you know, he's going to hurt his back in this position. But what they don't realize is the person's spine, although is a bit flexed as they're lifting in the deadlift, it remains in that position all the way through the movement. The problem would be is if they then go into extension at the end, because now they're under load, and once again they're giving a shear force in the spine. Global flexion, global extension, or braced flexion, braced extension is perfectly safe, and it's used in sports all the time. And I'm sure you've heard a ski instructor say to you, oh, you need a rounded back, or ski down as though somebody's punched you in the stomach and you're like this. The problem is again, as a cue from a coach, it can be misinterpreted. And what I see sometimes is people with severely rounded thoracic spines, and they end up with this shoulder internal rotation at this point here, and they look like, you know, sort of this douchebag syndrome, where They're really in this forward position. And obviously from a pole planting point of view, if we go back to our mogul skier, let's say, we can see that she doesn't have this position, you know. It actually looks like she's almost retracting and pulling the scapula down. And if we look at Marcel Hirscher, we'll see the same. He's not in a position where the shoulders are dipping forwards. So the mechanics are important, that we understand what we mean by global extension and flexion as opposed to local. But it is important you understand that it's the movement of the spine when under load that is controversial, as opposed to having some rounding of the back as you're skiing down to help absorb and to help you to be in a more dynamic position. You can't always be in braced neutral. It's just not possible. So yes, we do want to avoid severe rounding and, you know, avoiding butt wink, which this is an important part as well when we talk about this, because if somebody has a tendency to tuck under, like this guy has, what's happening here is the hamstrings have basically gone slack. They've lost their ability for the stretch reflex reaction here to be powerful and strong. He's tucked under. We see this a bit in the mobile field, especially when you see people with their heads bouncing around and they've tucked under and they've lost the posterior chain, the power that's needed there. So it's important we address these issues of the lumbar spine here, and this being this bit here, and what this guy should be doing to prevent the pelvis from tucking under. We're not going to go too much into it, but the reason obviously we don't want movement when under load is because of compression and shear forces. So it's quite all right to sit in a deep squat position and be actually in a rounded back, because I'm not under load at the minute. So, you know, people sit like this all over the world and they're very healthy people and they have great mobility and no issues in their hip and back. The problem would be is if I stuck a big weight on my back and I started to do this. Now I'm under load and now we are putting the spine, you know, in a weak position and a compromised position. So I always prioritize midline stabilization with people. Then I look at mobility and stance. Then I look at positions in a sport, in this case skiing and boarding. And to help people tune in to their core strength, which is going to hold their spine in a position, I often just take an elastic band, gym band, up onto the mountain, and by using the gym band, I can start to, in the case Jamie's holding me and I'm providing myself with a vector force here as I extend my arms, I can explain to people and give them a chance to feel that rotational force that they're having to resist against. So if you watch one of my videos when I start discussing how to train core stability, I particularly want people first to get used to being able to hold positions before they start doing things like wood choppers and other types of mobile exercises with twisting. Because before we want people to twist, we want to see their ability just to hold still. And this is a great way to do this because there are rotational forces in the turn. And this is one reason why people in a short turn or sometimes in a long turn have this problem of following the ski round too much and dropping to the inside. So using a band is a great way for me to educate people into what they have to do to maintain the integrity of the core and spine. And I've already mentioned a little bit about the pelvis and how it can have an effect. You know, you've probably seen skiers who ski in this very, very arched position in the lower back. Often they've come from riding horses. And equally, we get people skiing in this position, as I mentioned before. Now, previously, we used to play with the pelvis a lot and try and work people into a good position. But actually, all we really should have been telling them to do was to tighten the glutes momentarily, and you naturally put your spine into your comfortable position, and then you're in neutral. You don't have to find neutral. You don't have to look in the mirror and source it. Just tighten for a few seconds and you'll get into a neutral position. So this leads me on to the importance of people training their position throughout the day, all the time. I tell people that I hold a good 20% of core strength fixed permanently through the day until the minute I fall asleep at night, I'm maintaining a bit of core, because otherwise I will slump down. It's natural, you know, you feel this is a more comfortable position just to rest on all your joints. But I guarantee you that mechanism and that thought process has been ingrained into you, and it's not going to help you when you suddenly need to spring and be dynamic. So to prove the issue of global flexion and extension, within gymnastics we practice a lot this arch and hollow position, where we want people to see, and you know, just holding this position still, if you try this, you'll find that you tremble and shake after a few seconds. And we would be holding positions like this for maybe 60 seconds to 2 minutes in just a hollow or an arch position. And it's really difficult holding this position. It's much more difficult than people think. What happens is they hold the position for a short time and then they break. And I'm sure you may have seen one of the videos where I put an elastic band under my lower back when I do this, and somebody pulls on the band to demonstrate that I am actually touching the ground there. And if I weaken, the first thing that's going to happen if I weaken is I'm going to break and the band will flick out. And it's a good way to process and make sure that I am staying in this braced position. Equally, compression's important. So we use this a lot in handstands, for example, within gymnastics, but from our point of view, we want to have the ability to be strong here. And I do drills with people where I've shown them before. You know, if you can't hold your leg here and let go of it without it dropping down, it's a demonstration of a weakness within the hip flexors. And we want you to be able to have that movement, because in this movement pattern here, it's this range of movement again, without going into extension as I lift up. I need that range of movement, let's say in a particularly deep mogul field, or if I hit a dip or something. So the back can be moved. We can move the spine, and we do exercises for it. I wouldn't advise doing this one, especially with weight, but certainly this exercise was used to get people to understand each vertebrae and see how you can move each vertebrae in your back safely when not under great load. Because what we have to remember is, as we apply another part, which is speed, it becomes very essential. So when doing a muscle up on rings, and rings are an open chain, it's much more difficult for me to pull myself up and to get into that position with no speed. Whereas if I do it as a kipping movement, and I actually use momentum, I can swing myself and use momentum to kip into a position that allows me to come up over the rings. Now, it's easier with the speed element and harder without the speed. However, the problem is if I am adding a speed element, and especially because I'm going into this extension and flexion position at speed, if I'm not making sure that I have torque and stability and I've got my glutes switched on, I'm putting myself at risk in many places because I've added a speed element to the movement. So when we do the bumps and we're practicing getting range of movement again, it's really important that we, you know, try exercises where we can just practice people getting in and out of this range of movement. So in this self-assessment that I'd like you lot to try at home, and you can do this with partners, or equally you can do this, for example, just with a video and video yourself with your phone. I want you to see which of these tests you can pass, because if you're failing some of these tests, it will be very beneficial to try to get to the point where you can pass them, and that's very possible with all these tests. But it's great to self-educate yourself to know what range of movement you have available to you. So in the squat hinge archetype here, what is very important is, as you can see, is I'm in bare feet. I have no shoes on. Okay, and I've talked about this time and time again, about the problems when we use our training shoes and things. Most shoes have a lift, if you're in training shoes, probably of about 8 to 10 millimeters in a running shoe, and in a CrossFit training shoe, let's say a Metcon or a Reebok Nano or something, it might be just 4 millimeters, but it's still a lift. You've still got a heel lift. And a heel lift allows and gives you a compensation to cheat the system, to cheat the ankle. So when we do these tests, it's important you're doing them in bare feet, because it also gives you a chance to practice subtalar neutral, to be able to see how the tripod of the foot works and to make sure that you maintain normal arch and that these arches aren't collapsing in any direction. So here I have to point my feet straightish forward, okay, because one of the compensatory things when somebody does a squat is they will spin their feet to the outside to compensate the ankles, and they will drop in again to make it easy. So we want to make sure that we're in this position, creating torque at the feet level, and we want to be able to track the knees slightly to the outside. I don't need to lose the first and fifth. I don't want to lose the big toe and little toe. I want them to be planted on the ground with a strong foot arch. We want a neutral back. The more mobile and flexible you are in your ankle and hip, you might have a lot more vertical position than I, as I am quite stiff in general. And it's interesting as well when I do a test like this, that it changes day to day. You know, sometimes I'm very good. I think, oh, you know, I'm really mobile, really flexible today. And other days I get up and I think, gee, I need to take a bit of a pace back today because I'm feeling everything's a bit tight. So we want full squat depth and we want a neutral spine. And it's very simple, these tests. I'm not asking you for a percentage. It's pass or it's fail. That's it. If you can't get full hip creep, or you're collapsing in, or you're making an immature squat, which would be this, just basically you're just dropping your chest forward. So if you think of this is something that happens a lot in snowboarding, when we're dealing with snowboarders, and you try to get them to use a bit of a range of movement, when they go down, they'll pitch forward instead and go, yeah, I'm moving up and down. Okay, so this is just cheating the system. And we do this as adults all the time. If I put this on the floor, and I was a 2-year-old child, and I was going to pick that up, I would actually pick it up like this. You can watch babies do this all the time. But as an adult, what we do is we do that. We hinge forward, and we wonder why we have problems. But it's just because we realise, oh, don't want to be bending those knees. Instead, we'll just hinge. So don't make an immature squat either. And this is a pass-fail. If you fail the test, I will discuss in future videos, and you can actually find some videos already online where I will help you get into this position within a few weeks. So the more upright the torso, the more motor control and range of motion and stabilisation are required. The good thing is when we're teaching, let's say, a back squat, we actually avoid this with beginners and actually go to a front squat first. I actually don't like teaching back squat because, especially young people, they tend to just keep chucking more and more weight on the bar, and they just end up in a very bad position, and they do all sorts of weird things with heavy weight, and they can get it up because they're young. But in this case, what I would rather do is teach somebody with a weight to the front, like a goblet squat, which you can see on my videos, and that changes the center of mass to be more forwards and allows them to be more vertical with the back. It reduces injury risk by far, and it prevents people actually from lifting too much weight, because it's much more challenging on the thoracic spine and the core to be able to make a front squat than it is to make a back squat. But if you can make a back squat that is relatively vertical, then you've got probably a lot of motor control. Now here, the test that we're looking at is trying to test our posterior chain in the hamstring, and we're looking for a pass that's been 90 degrees. Now you can see I've done it twice, once with my toes back and once in a plantar flex position with the toes in this position. And the reason for that is that some of you may find this behind the knee a bit too tight, whereas this will just give you a little bit of ease in that behind the knee to get into this 90-degree position. But again, remember the compensations. I can cheat this by simply breaking my lower back to bring my leg to 90 degrees. I can also bend my knee to get it further up. The idea is to make sure that your knee is straight, your back is in a neutral position, and you want 90 degrees of flexion. Now, interestingly with this test, and this is why you do need somebody who is a good coach to understand what's going on, because not everybody, when they fail this test, has tight hamstrings. So I often see this within a group of 30 people when I'm doing tests in a hall. I'll pick on somebody that I can see fails this test, but actually they don't have tight hamstrings. And you have to remember that if somebody has tight hamstrings, you would say to them, you need to stretch your hamstrings. So you may put a towel down, or you may do some sort of standard hamstring stretch. But what might happen occasionally is somebody actually has the hamstring already that is in a long position, and it's stuck in a long position. And this is more to do with weak core, and it's a diagonal coming into the psoas at the front. And often when I get into the psoas at the front and just make a little bit of force in the right position, I can get their leg and just take it past 90 degrees to 100 degrees. And all of a sudden people go, you've just fixed his tight hamstrings. He doesn't have tight hamstrings, and the worst thing he can do is start to stretch something that's already stretched. Instead, we have to look at strengthening exercises to the opposite side. So it's not always as simple as it looks. So this was the squat hinge side of things, and what is important was the torque side. And understanding that here where we're lifting over 200 kilos, and a hex bar makes it a little bit easier than a straight bar, this is the type of thing that requires 1 rep maximum effort and incredible amounts of torque and resistance. Whereas when Julian's lifting this 20 kilogram kettlebell, it's 10 times less weight. He doesn't need to get down and go and start tightening up that much because it is less weight. In skiing, having somebody who misinterprets core strength and almost ends up blocking themselves because they're so rigid would be stupid as well. If when teaching boxing, for example, when we want somebody to punch, you don't want them tight. You want them loose until the point of impact, where at the point of impact they will tighten momentarily and release again. A bit like in skiing, when going onto high edge angle and you come to do your classic hip angulation, you may tighten there because you know maximum forces is going to hit the ski, but then you want to release all that tension because you want the deflection, and that deflection would be blocked if you remained contracted everywhere and tight. So knowing how much to brace and how much to relax becomes a skill. We're now looking at the adductors and looking through into this lateral lunge test, where a lot of people will suffer a lot, especially when trying to do it on the inside here, where my foot is pointing forward and my body is relatively upright. This is difficult. Notice again that the foot arch hasn't collapsed on the right leg. I've maintained subtalar neutral. On this side here, you can see that I've actually spun the foot onto the calcaneus to the outside, and this is going to be more on the hamstrings, but it's a bit easier to get into this position now than it is in this position. Again, do you pass or fail this position? Of course, we can do all these assessments by passive methods, so a second person can make the assessment. For you lot, you don't necessarily have to do that, but if you do have the opportunity within internal and external rotation of the hip, have somebody with you, it's very easy for somebody to follow this information and to see how much movement you have in your hip, because it is important. If you think about it in a short term, if you lack internal rotation or external rotation, then at some point you're going to get an impingement, you're going to get bone on bone, and it's going to want to bring your whole body out, it's going to want to bring your butt to the outside. So somebody I measured just yesterday had only 10 degrees of internal rotation, and there should be really about 30 plus. And I could see when we watched him on the piste doing a short turn that it was difficult for him. You know, the butt and the pelvis would move. And the ski instructor would say, okay, I need to do my keep the poles down the hill with an X or whatever. But what they're not understanding is that this person has a challenge that they need to address off the hill. And also on top of that, my advice to him was to be more flexed in his short turns, because that flexion just gave him a little bit of extra range of movement. And it worked very well. Enough range of movement for him to be able to get that short turn going without too much body rotation. So here I am doing the external rotation test. And when I do this, it's very important, by the way, that maybe you take it to R1. Nobody should be doing R2. This is just a resistance check. So you will feel if you twist somebody's leg externally. I know this looks like it's going in over, but in the hip socket, this is an external rotation. If I do this, you'll feel like a pushback. When you feel that pushback, just stop. We would take it a little further because we know what we're doing to what we call R2, just to assess full range. And normal range of movement would be 30 to 45 degrees. What you often see in the external range of movement is they have 45 degrees. But then when you go internally, they have 15. And that discrepancy between the two is a problem. Now what we have to remember is that a lot of what we do is not bilateral. So in a squat, which is bilateral movement, both feet are on the ground, I have external rotation from both sides, okay, and internal rotation down here. Now, in skiing, you're going to have external and internal at the same time, unless you're doing a plow turn. So what we have to think about is we need access to internal rotation. And I think most of you, when you test this one at R1, will find that it's a little bit short. And it's not easy to work exercises to get this back for people. It's a bit more confusing. So we want to be able to get people to educate themselves as to how much range of movement they have in that squat hinge archetype, and then also we have had time to look in the hip as well to see what you're like. Here, the very important pistol archetype, well, come on, in skiing, it's got to be one of the key factors. But that said, in my disdain and dislike of ski boots and anything that's manufactured with very, very high heel lifting, you will get away with it if you have minimum dorsiflexion, because of the fact that in your ski boot, if you watch my recent video on ski boot fit, you'll hear me explain about how much you are being pitched forward anyway in your boot. And this is a forgiveness thing. If somebody cannot do a squat with flat feet like I am in barefoot shoes now, and if I can't get into a squat and I get stuck here, I can basically put something under here, under the heel, so 2 plates, 5 kilo plates, lift their heels up a bit, and all of a sudden they can get themselves into a squat because I've cheated the system. So a ski boot, in a sense, is cheating the system to a degree. But I would like to see if you can get into this with both feet forward, subtalar neutral, keep your knees together and come down. Now a lot of you will come down and feel like you're going to fall backwards, so be very careful what's behind you. And then you can stick your leg out and see if you can get into this position. And remember, we need to maintain subtalar neutral, and that means the tripod of the foot and not collapsing the arch. So when we do this, and I do it passively, and I'm testing Jamie's dorsiflexion here and his plantar flexion. The other day I tested somebody and they were at about 5 degrees. And you know, we want to really be getting down to 15 and 20 degrees of dorsiflexion. Dorsiflexion being this position, you know, of being able to dorsiflex and plantar flex. Okay? So in that position here, for example, when we do the old 5-inch rule test, that is a fist and a thumb to the wall, you can see the foot arch here and the big toe on the ground, and I'm touching my knee on the wall. If I couldn't do that, that would be a sign that there's a bit of a shortage of movement. Now, what people will do though when they do this test, and you'll see them, is they'll come forward, they'll not reach the wall, And the brain will think, hang on, the target is to reach the wall. He said get to the wall with your knee. All right, okay, I'll just collapse in, pronate, and just slam my knee forward. Hey, I've got loads of range of movement. The body has a way around things, and that actually is not going to damage your Achilles tendon or anything, but it's certainly not going to do you any good. So just be aware that it is so important, the ability to have this foot arch. And we've seen this before where I've lifted Olympic weights and I'm talking about the heel to toe drop. So in these type of shoes, a bit like ski boots, there is a huge heel lift here of 24 millimeters. But in weightlifting, it's there for a reason. I do warm up barefoot first. Even doing an Olympic snatch, I would warm up barefoot. But when lifting heavier weights, to get this heavier weight to stay over the top of me here with my poor shoulder mobility, then what I'm doing is I'm cheating the system to make me more vertical with my back by putting a heel lift in of 24 millimeters. And of course, in any Olympic weightlifting, you will see people wearing shoes like this. And it's relatively, for this sport, important. But what's most important is if I wear this shoe and then I take it off and then I stick on my training shoes, which have a 10 millimeter lift, and I walk around all day with them or sit about with these on, I'm permanently in a forward position, which is going to have an effect on the plantar, the underneath my foot, around the Achilles, into the soleus, the gastrocs. Everything's going to be getting tighter and tighter and tighter. So being in a position where you can take your shoes off and be in bare feet as much as possible is a great advantage, especially when you think for 5 or 6 hours every day you're in ski boots, and that's when you're moving around. You need to get out them ski boots and also get out of any other shoe that is going to cramp your toe box. And this is the issue again with things, not just the heel lift, but the toe spring. So if you look at a lot of shoes as well, we'll see them, they even curl up over at the front where your toes are. And this was seen as being another great advantage or a great thing because it allows us to come off our toes to make the proper gait cycle when walking. Absolute bollocks. It's doing nothing but creating problems under here where eventually you might get plantar fasciitis or it's probably the wrong word for it actually, it's not really called that now, but most of you will know it as that. And this is the issue, is the shoe that you're wearing is often the problem. And just changing your shoes and getting into bare feet can be a big thing. That said, I did mention on my last video, I don't want people just throwing their shoes away and switching to barefoot shoes because your feet aren't strong enough to cope with that yet. It'll take a long time to develop that strength in your foot, so be cautious of just following blindly what I say. When we watch skiers go down, they have here access to this ankle range of movement, and this is, typical class 2 lever. It's got a lot of ability to spring and have a reflex and stretch reflex reaction that they're very, very good at deflecting the ski. So the range of movement they have is important, but on top of the range of movement is the torque and tension that they're able to get into that. So the next lunge archetype test I want to do is a great test because it's also the fix to your problem as well. And it's called the couch stretch. And it was a savior for me about 8 or 9 years ago when I started doing this. It made a big, big difference. Just doing this 2 to 3 minutes on left and right side. But we're going to use it first as a test. You can see that I've jammed my knee into the corner of the wall, my shin's up against it, and what I'm going to do for many of you, just getting into position 1 here may be a challenge. You might get to that position and actually just feel like the whole fascia has just been torn apart in your leg. So just getting in this position would be okay, that's something. But what we want is we want the glutes active, we want you to be able to breathe, and we want you to get into position 2. So now I'm in front foot on the ground position. So before it was on knee position. Then if I can get into this position, I want to get into this position with a vertical torso. Notice again that I'm not cheating the system with this position and just going into extension. Okay, that's just you trying to get your hands to the wall because somebody says, oh, if you can get your hands to the wall, you must be good. Oh, well, I can do that. I'll do it somehow. Okay, I'll tear one arm off and stick it on the wall. Always, always do these tests as proper as you can. They're for you. They're not about achieving a particular goal by cheating it. So, interestingly, when I do tests to do with the big toe, and this is an important test if you're a runner or, you know, you are required to use your toes to for your gait cycle, etc., then if you have limitations in your big toe movement, this does create a huge problem that later leads to knee and hip injuries, etc. We're not going to go too much into that because in the case of skiing, obviously, as you're probably aware, you're quite flat in the boot and your toes are usually crushed together, which is what I disagree with in the toe box. Passive testing again, which you don't need to look at too much. I don't want to go too much into the upper body, although I have already mentioned, you know, about people ending up in this rounded position. But having range of movement with the overhead position is a great thing to look, because men are constantly coming to me. One of the things they'll say most of all, oh, I've got really bad shoulder pain, like, what can I do? And usually you can see what they should be doing is stopping their bench pressing and biceps and maybe doing some rows to try and balance out something. But their inability to be able to move the scapula at the back or have access to certain muscles and joints, it's shocking in men, you know, and it's one of the commonest injuries. Often elbows as well. But again, a bit like the knee, the elbow is at the mercy of the wrist and the shoulder. It's just stuck in the middle. So these tests here are designed to see what the range of movement is in somebody's shoulder. So if they're going to be doing anything, especially if I see now people getting more and more into things like HIIT training from CrossFit, etc. Once you start doing these type of WODs, and they have a lot of overhead stuff in it, we see injuries just jumping up because people don't have the range of movement, so they make compensations. And you see this a lot when people go to hang off a bar. They end up doing a pull-up that looks a bit like a bench press. They sort of pull up in this direction as opposed to being able to actually activate the correct muscles and pull up correctly. It's so common that people are not able to get their arm over their head without bending their elbow to cheat the system again. So we want people to understand the overhead archetype, also the front rack archetype, because again, even with something as simple as your pole plant, we want to be able to not create problems in the wrist, the elbow, or the shoulder when pole planting, especially when using blocking pole plants. We will look at the importance of practicing, because practice makes permanent. It doesn't make you perfect. If you're practicing something and you're practicing wrong, then you are permanently ingraining a wrong movement in your body. And I saw that just this week when I was testing something for the YouTube channel and I wanted to go up and teach people something, and I watched them hockey stop, for example, and I could see how that hockey stop, which they must do, you know, 30, 40 times in a day, was having a negative effect on their ability to make a short turn. So be always aware of any movement you do regularly will have an effect. So make sure whatever movement that is, you're doing it accurately. You can follow all this mobility routine as I develop it on the YouTube channel and see what sort of things I do. On the right here, you can see some of the things that I may use when trying to get mobile and warming myself up, etc. And certainly at night time, it's one of the things I use to help me sleep at night better, is some of these tools here to just ease down at the end of the day. I hope that you're able to look at yourself and get a bit of an idea what you think you should focus on. Maybe you have a good coach at home who can, you know, help you if you say, look, I feel like I'm lacking in range of movement in certain areas, and that coach might be to help you. But if not, then certainly follow us, because we will go through this over the season, over the next few decades. We're going to be here. We can't wait for you to join us, and we'll see you soon, hopefully with Ski Instructor Academy.